Good evening, Harlem and Harlems of the world. We are pre-recording, but it is a great day here in Harlem. I'm Terri Wisdom, and this is Harlem Network News. And as you can see in the background, the monument in Washington of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stands behind me. And we, of course, are celebrating the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King. I first want to just send up prayers for all the ancestors, which of course, Dr. King is an ancestor at this time, and for all of those that lost their lives in that span of time, because there were many assassinations in the 60s. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was, of course, one who was assassinated. Malcolm X was assassinated. President President John Kennedy was assassinated, and his brother, Robert Kennedy, was assassinated. So there was much that went on in a short period of time, and it was a very dynamic time in the country and in the world as it is today. Harlem Network News is a new media platform, and we really want to make sure that everyone is informed, because knowledge is power and activism is power. And one of the things that I love about thinking about the holiday, the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King, is that it is a living historic holiday. It is happening now. It was created in our lifetime. People, rode hard to make it happen. Stevie Wonder, Bill Scott Heron, happy birthday to Dr. King. So happy birthday, Dr. King. And we're still here and the struggle continues. Today, I have with us to just give her reflections and her involvement and her thoughts as we celebrate the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Dawn Jones. Dawn works with NAN. She's very involved with the Democratic clubs, voting, and all of that. And maybe you can explain a little bit. I don't want to assume that anybody knows everything. So tell us, what is NAN? Tell us what your role is and just who you are and whose you are. Thank you so much for joining us on this historic day of reflection. Thank you. And action.
Yes, greetings, and thank you, Terri, for having me on this evening. I'm a national board member of National Action Network. National Action Network was founded in 1991. I joined in 1999 after I call it, assassination of Amadou Diallo in the Bronx on February 4th, 1999. And then I became a national board member in 2003 after the shooting of Sister Alberta Sproul, who was a member of Convent Avenue Baptist Church and also a union member. I work for the city of New York during the day, and I'm on the board of National Action Network. My affiliation with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is from when I lived in Teaneck, New Jersey on Stuyvesant Road. A lady by the name of Theodore Lacey, who's Alpha Kappa Alpha. She was a teacher in Teaneck, and she actually has a street named after her and a school named after her in Teaneck, New Jersey, which is a small suburban town. So that's significant when you have 3 towns and then it's 70 towns that are predominantly white. She was in Alabama with Rosa Parks. She actually brought Rosa Parks to our elementary school that was Ben Franklin Junior High School. And she was with the King family. She was at the March on Washington. So that's my first affiliation with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And then being a part of National Action Network, almost each and every year, Reverend Sharpton has had marches on Washington. This year will be the 60th anniversary. And then he has dinners down at the Sheridan during the convention that is usually around the assassination date, which is April 4th.
Thank you, Sharon.
Basically, that is my affiliation with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. I happen to usually take off on his actual birth date, the 15th. I know that they fought hard for the birthday and they did a petition, and the federal holiday is on Monday, but I believe in recognizing the actual day. And I usually always take off on his assassination date, which is April 4th. So, you know, I consider myself part of the King movement, partly from when I was in Teaneck, New Jersey, and then now that I'm here in the city. And I try to do something that relates to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, whether it's the Baptist Ministers Conference at Convent Avenue Baptist Church, where I'm a member. There also the prison ministry is having something in the afternoon. We plan to go to the Apollo on his actual birthday tomorrow after church services. And then National Action Network, you know, they always have their King Day. First they're in Washington, D.C., and then at a breakfast. And then in the afternoon, they're at the House of Justice from approximately 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock. And then in the evening, the New Amsterdam Musical Association will be recognizing Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, where I just became the corresponding secretary of that great institution that celebrated their centennial this year.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing, Dawn. And those of you who are just joining us, I'm Terri Wisdom, and this is Harlem Network News. And we just give up prayers, as I stated before, for all of those ancestors, which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of them. We have been plagued with much in our community coming off of the pandemic, where we lost lives. And also the other pandemic, which is basically, I call it the shooting and the assassination of our people. Mainly a lot of men, but it is happening to women as well. It is personal for me, as well as my son lost life due to gunshot in November 5th of 2021 on the Shinnecock Reservation. So this is pervasive, this is everywhere. I am a member of an incredible organization that was started by Jackie Rowe Adams,
Yes.
Harlem Mothers and Fathers Save. Jackie lost 2 sons to gun violence. And unfortunately, we have a lot of members of that club. So as we say, a luta continua, the struggle really continues. We have much to contend with. Dawn, where would you say we are in all of the ideals and things that Dr. King stood for? And in your view, what are some of the ideals that Dr. King stood for? What are some of the goals that he achieved? And what has it been since the loss of his life and us actually, you know, being able to have a birthday celebration for Dr. King? And I feel like it's just so different having, it's living history. It happened during our lifetime and it has like real meaning. And that's not to say that other holidays are not of significance in the country, you know, whether it's the 4th of July or Memorial Day or, you know, President's Day, but this is really a direct correlation and a connection to our lives. So would you share, because I always want to assume that in Harlem Network News, we want to make sure everybody really has a full understanding of what happened, you know, with the civil rights movement. I know I had the honor, I actually was one of those young people who was bused. I lived in New York City, I lived in Queens, and there was busing that took place. And initially, busing was supposed to go 2 ways, you know, where whites would be bused into Black neighborhoods and Blacks would be going into, you know, the white neighborhoods, but it never happened. Busing was a 1-way street. So it was Blacks that got bused. I was on a school bus for an hour and a half. And, you know, I got a great education, but it also made me the person that I am today, because instead of calling us the N-word, they were like, oh, she's a bus child. You know, so it was all of this that we went through, and it really propelled me to know, after going to an elementary school where I was bused, going to a junior high school, that for high school, I was going back to my neighborhood school. And when it was time for college, I was going to a Black college, and I attended Lincoln University. And I think, you know, during that time, a lot of the movement came from the young people in the late 60s with all that we went through, and we had the Black is Beautiful movement, and all of that. We just changed. And I say that because last week we had on the Grandassa models, which are part of the Black is Beautiful exhibit. And I know when folks hear this interview, the exhibit will be closing at 5 o'clock. But we've been putting it out on our social media. It's a must-see, and it really talks about the transformation of a people. And it's through photography, through the great photography of Kwame Braithwaite. It talks about the AJAZ organization, which was created by Kwame Braithwaite and his brother, Alambe Brath, an activist, graphic artist, all kinds of things. And then it also talks about the African nationalist movement, which was created coming out of the Garvey movement with Carlos Cooks, and then later Charles Pica. So there's a lot of information that's packed into that. And just a little tidbit, because I learned something all the time doing Harlem Network News, that in fact, there was a conference in 1959 that Carlos Cooks organized. And at that conference, it was decided that we were no longer going to be called colored or Negro, and we were going to be Black and African American. And I thought that that just happened organically, but the fact that there was actually a conference to bring that into the fruition is just amazing. So enough said, Dawn. Share your experience of that time and what the civil rights movement meant to you, and your understanding. And I guess I gave that whole long story. I'm Terri Wisdom. This is Harlem Network News. But my granddaughter, who's 17, I'm always sharing a lot of things with her and what I'm doing on Harlem Network News. And, whatever she was studying in school, suddenly she said to me, Grandma, were you really alive and you experienced segregation? And, even though I'm saying this, it really didn't register to her that this was actually a part of life that I lived. So that's why I'm always want to just express, because our audience that we're listening to is intergenerational. So it's very important that our young people get the timeline of what really happened and what we really experienced, And I will say all the time, at a point, Black people weren't even on television. And I remember my grandmother used to call everyone in the whole family, and she'd be like, put on channel 4, they got colored on TV, So, it's a different day in a way. But share, Dawn, what stands out for you in terms of Dr. King, the civil rights movement, and what occurred and where we are today? Have we rolled way forward or have we rolled back? Thank you.
Well, I definitely will not say that we've rolled forward, because Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was in Memphis fighting for workers' rights, voting rights, and we are still here out on the battlefield. If you just look at the nurses were fighting for their contract. I'm a member of District Council 37, Local 371. I actually took off from NAN that day to attend the Labor Day parade because we are fighting for a contract. So even though we have a quote unquote Black mayor, we are working at our city jobs without a contract. So that was something that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was fighting for when he was assassinated in Memphis for the sanitation workers. And we are still in that same fight as he was back then. So that's the reason why I say that, no, we have not moved forward. And as you stated, because I was in a suburban town, I chose to go to a historical Black college. And even today, people probably don't know, but you're familiar with the Philip Pennell case that was back in April 1990, but now we are in 2023.
If you would break it down, because everybody's not familiar with the Philip Pennell case. So would you elaborate on that a little bit, Dawn, please?
Okay. Philip Pennell was shot in Teaneck, New Jersey in the back by a white officer My girlfriend and I were home, and she let me know that someone was shot at the park. But when we got to Intervale Avenue, we actually saw his body laying on the ground, and then there were riots in the town. I happened to move to the city that following month when I got a city job, because it was very difficult for me to get a permanent job just coming out of college. And my mom actually had a master's degree and was substitute teaching before she died. She was not able to get a permanent job out there. So I moved on into the city. And now we're in 2023, and there's a case in Englewood, New Jersey, the neighboring town. Okay, which people probably aren't even aware of the case, but that family's been coming to Sharpton every Saturday. So that is the reason that I say we're actually going backwards instead of forward. Our young people are still getting gunned down by the police, whether it's in the suburbs, it's in the city. And as far as jobs are concerned, I'm basically trying to stay and retire, but it's just not getting any better. You know, I'm in Esplanade Gardens, maintenance is going up, salary is not, had to take a night job. And for what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King fought for, we're really not getting between the job situation and between the voting. Okay, we have so much voter registration, but voter suppression and all the things that go on with voting, we really have not gained. That's just the way that I see it.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. For those of you who are just joining, I'm Terri Wisdom, and this is Harlem Network News, and we are honored to be here. We are the voice and the drumbeat of Harlem. You can find us on all of the social media, and soon we plan to be on public access television so that more folks can just hear us, you know, no matter what some of the challenges are in terms of the internet and all of that, because, you know, there are disparities in that as well, where everyone does not have access to the internet, you know, even that, you know, really showed itself as we went through the pandemic and our young people were having to do school online. And there were some who really just couldn't get on. They were sharing a cell phone or sitting in McDonald's, you know, so there are health disparities, there's educational disparities, you know, in every aspect, economic disparities. These are things that we are still dealing with today. So it's very important, the work that Harlem Network News is doing. Their systemic racism is across the board. Mainstream television often is not telling our story. And, you know, but it's important that we tell our own stories so that they're told right and that we reach the people. So that's what Harlem Network News is really, really here to do. So what do you think, Dawn Jones of NAN and member of DC 37, and having experienced some of the things firsthand, what do you think it is that we need to do to really keep up the legacy of Dr. King and to really put into practice some of the things that Dr. King stood for? But first, let's identify in your words, what were some of the things that Dr. King stood for? What were some of the steps that he took? And obviously, he was Reverend Dr. Martin Jr. So yes, he was a man of God. So what are some of the things that you believe he stood for and what led him in that direction?
Okay, well, what I would say that he definitely stood for were workers, for human rights, voting rights. And I mean, basically, we have been doing that at the National Action Network. We commemorate his birthday, January 15th, for the federal holiday each and every year. The Convent Avenue Baptist Church Ministers Conference does it, as well as the New Amsterdam Musical Association. They do it through the music diaspora. Okay, but and we also do the assassination date, but we're not in the position now where we're really doing the fight the way that he did. Even though we're going to commemorate that 60th anniversary, we're going to get on that bus and go to Washington. We're going to organize, but when we come back, it's going to be business as usual. because everyone does not stand for the king, and they're not in the king movement. If you're on a job, there are some people who wouldn't mind working on Monday, you know, or they see it as a day off, as Reverend Sharpton said, to go to the mall. It's not a day to go to the mall. It's the day to practice what he basically stood for and what he was fighting for when he was assassinated. So that's why I always take that day. I may not be able to do all three that I mentioned, but I'll do one out of the three. Okay, because one, you know, you don't want to get burnt out. You don't want to fall asleep at your third event. And secondly, we got to keep in mind we are still in COVID, and you don't want to be too much mixed up in the crowds. But as I stated, during this weekend, I started at the House of Justice this morning, plan to be at the Apollo in the afternoon, and I will do something as it relates to King this weekend. But it's very difficult to carry out his practices and principles because of what we're up against, whether it's management where you're residing, management where you're working, and everyone is not on the same page. I will say that the unions do try their best, but we don't always get what King fought for back in the 60s. And then it's just a reality. I mean, you look at the nurses, you look at the transit workers, you look at all the workers that he was fighting for, and we're really not getting our fair share as
I think I'm in agreement with you, and I think that these are very, very trying times. I mean, I know that each generation has their trying times. I know that when my mother grew up in the 20s, they were experiencing the Great Depression. You know, there were many things that were happening, obviously, which is why Dr. King took a stand and took a step. You know, there were, you know, hangings of Black men in particular going all through the South, which caused, you know, Billie Holiday to write a song and sing a song, Strange Fruit, you know, of the hanging. You know, most recently we saw in the cinematic version, the Emmett Till, which is a very, very powerful film that I encourage everyone to see, and just how one mother stood up courageously. And, you know, ironically in the film, it references a couple that she stayed with, which was actually Medgar Evers, who is another Black man who was shot and killed in his driveway.
That's right.
You know, so it's important that we look at as many of the documentaries that we can, get the information. I most recently watched Descendants on Netflix, which is all about the last slave ship that came over. And I believe it's the Clotilda, and it came in 1860, which it was illegal for it to come. And there was a man who was a teenager who actually Zora Neale Hurston wrote a book about, you know, and I think it was called Barracuda, the book. But this is a man who actually remembered his family, and he was always distraught that he couldn't go back to Africa. And then finally, after the emancipation, he actually started a town called Africatown. You know, so it's a very powerful story that really talks about our journey and what brought us to Martin Luther King standing up, to Fannie Lou Hamer standing up, to, you know, our bus strikes and all of those things. But one of the key issues of the movement was education, you know, separate but equal. And I honestly believe, especially here in Harlem, and I can't speak about the other Harlems of the world, but we have some extreme situations going on regarding education. In Harlem, though we have, quote, gentrification, 99.9% of the young people in the public schools here in Harlem are Black and brown. And the education that they're getting is separate, and it is not equal. And that glared its, you know, ugly head during the pandemic, because it showed that they didn't have tablets. They didn't have the experience of working with computers. They had old computers or no computers, you know, so it showed what the digital divide and the economic divide really is. So
Mhm.
if you would like to comment on that, I know with NAN, there's a lot of activism that happens on everything. So what are your thoughts, Dawn Jones, in terms of the education? And then you mentioned the fact that, you know, we do have a Black mayor, we have a lot of Blacks in public officials, but, you know, we still have a war on our hands. So what are your thoughts and what has to happen to change?
Okay, well, now when you speak of education, Gina Williams is the chairwoman of the National Action Network Education Committee. So she's someone that I would suggest that you bring on to speak more in depth with education. But what we're trying to do at the National Action Network, we just hosted a forum on Kwanzaa. That was like our end of the year celebration, and we're getting ready to do Black History. We were actually deciding on a date today, because when I used to chair African American Experience Forum and I stepped down, when they were trying to get me to stay, they were saying, well, how are the children going to get this education? Because they're not getting it in the schools. So I know for sure that's one thing that they're not getting. Okay, I saw you at Reverend Dr. Butts when we were at Thurgood Marshall. And I can remember when I was in high school, I actually finished high school at Norman Thomas High School.
Oh, okay.
And yes, and my father's friend's son actually had to go to Riverdale to school, which, you know, what's that, Philston, Dalton, those schools are like,
yes, some of the private schools.
She had to spend $50,000 a year because of the lack of education here in Central Harlem. She lives in Riverbend. So I am definitely, you know, familiar with the situation with education, and also because of the way it's not even just Harlem. A friend of mine is in Brooklyn Heights, which, you know, that's a predominantly white area, but
Absolutely.
The way these buildings are structured, sometimes we can't always get Wi-Fi. So here we are working at our city jobs, and they provided us with tablets, but me and another person who lives in a building, we would have issues with, and I don't know exactly what it is, but then they ended up getting resolved because of the way, you know, it also might have also been the capital improvement. So that was a situation, even though we were provided with equipment, we couldn't always log on. So like I stated, as far as with the education, I'd bring on Gina Williams, but what we're trying to do is on February 4th, have Black History at the National Action Network. After they've heard Reverend Sharpton give the history during the day, we would have someone come in the afternoon, and that way we would be able to have an interactive audience, because the rally is on the radio and the television. So it's not always easy to do interaction. We do what's called What's on Your Mind, but in the afternoon, if we have that teaching session, that would be the way for people to get their history. The unions do it, but as far as in the schools, I do hear that from, but you got to remember, I finished high school here in the city, but I went to suburban schools and I went to school in the South. Okay, and then I started working, but I definitely hear that. And most of the people who got their education, they had to spend a lot of money to get through. They went to the private schools, the Daltons, the Philstons, in Riverdale and Manhattan.
Yes, and now we have other things that are going on in terms of the school system, in terms of charter schools, you know, versus the public schools. And that's something else to look at, because it's almost like how the jails are an industrial complex, the schools have been privatized, you know, so we've got to look at, okay, what is going on? We've got so many elements. Before I know we don't have a lot of time, Dawn Jones, but if you could just share what happened at National Action Network today, and who the speaker was, and really what the message was. And then I'm going to play a little bit of a clip from Dr. King so we can embody and embrace him. But just share what the conversation was today at the National Action Network. Thank you.
Yes. Well, the speaker was Reverend Dr. Carl Washington. That's Zion Baptist Church here in Harlem, and our Assemblywoman Inez Dickens. She happens to be a member. I actually can remember when she joined, because my friend was campaigning with her, and she said, Inez joined the church. So I see that she stuck with it. She was there on stage with her pastor. And the one thing that I remember from this morning, how we hear the speech about I have a dream, but that is not what he went to Washington to speak about. And basically, he's the head of the Empire State Conference, and he basically clarified that for us about what his actual speech was. And that's what I found very interesting. And Reverend Sharpton, he spoke about where the song from Stevie Wonder came from. Even though, you know, we celebrated our birthdays at your restaurant, Best in May. I celebrated my 50th.
Yes,
and we all sing happy birthday to you. But Reverend Sharpton broke down the lyrics. That song was written by Stevie Wonder for Dr. King when they were fighting for the holiday. I mean, as a person who's tried to get street names and was not successful, I know how hard it is when you have to go get signatures. And that's what they did back in the 60s. And that song, and then other people that they brought into the movement, is the way they were able to get that holiday. And that was what Reverend Sharpton spoke about this morning. So I thought it was a wonderful rally with the music. And then, as you know, Mahalia Jackson, Precious Lord. There was a young lady, that's Reverend Richardson is our choir director, who sang that at the very end. And she was actually in tears. So all the music today was relevant. I mean, I felt like I've already had my pre-King celebration at the House of Justice. On this Saturday morning.
Yeah, absolutely. I was listening in online, and I was very impressed with the meaning of Dr. King's speech, because it's always talked about, I had a dream and all of that. But really, as you said, he was talking about the work and the things that we have to do. You know, so I think that's very empowering. And the backstory, I'm Terri, this is Harlem Network News, and I'm here with Dawn Jones, who is a great part of the Democratic Club, and also on the board at NAN, a very active part of our community. You know, she also works with NAMA, which is a music organization that celebrated its centennial. So Dawn is a community activist. But the circumstance about the song that Stevie Wonder wrote is just a very unique story. And I encourage everyone, as I stated, I went to one of the HBCUs, one of the first, Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. And my classmate there, which was just a perfect place for me, was Gil Scott-Heron.
Yes.
And Gil Scott-Heron started his band there. You know, he was inspired by Abby O'Doon of the Last Poets. And just, you know, when you talk to people, you learn stories. But Abby O'Doon and the Last Poets came to Lincoln University and performed. And then after, they went to Gil's room. And, you know, my roommate and I and my best friend, we went up to Gil's room too, because we really wanted to, you know, talk and find out more about everything. But I learned from Abby O'Doon just recently that, you know, after the performance and in the discussion, Gil said to Abby O'Doon, hey man, I'm thinking about starting a band. And Abby O'Doon said, well, go ahead. You know what I'm saying? So it began right there. But Gil Scott-Heron has a book out. It's the last book that he had come out. It came out posthumously, and it's called The Last Holiday. And reading that book, I got so much insight into many things that were going on at Lincoln University that I was a part of, but I was also 17 at the time. So I was a part of it, but in reading his book, because he was a couple of years older, I got to really understand some of the nuts and bolts of what was happening. Because we actually that year had to leave school early because the Ku Klux Klan was burning crosses on our campus. And this was after we had done a candlelight vigil, because it was when, you know, Jackson State and Kent State, when students were actually killed on their campuses. So there was a lot that transpired. But what I came to understand is that Gil Scott-Heron worked very closely with Stevie Wonder in terms of getting the song out to people, gathering the support. You know, so these things did not take place in isolation. You know, even there's another film on Netflix about the Black cinema. It's an incredible piece. It's about 2 hours long, but it really talks about Arthur Michaud and all kinds of people, but there's some great interviews with Harry Belafonte, and his involvement in Dr. King's movement. And, the fact that he gave money and, did so many things. So many of our actors and activists were involved in the movement integrally with Dr. King. So I think that's what we have to understand. And that's really, really what it takes. So I'm going to just see right now if I can play a clip of Dr. King, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the relevance of Dr. King right here in our community in terms of some of the, I would say politics and elections that we're dealing with right now. So, but without further ado, let's listen a bit to Dr. King. And this was
this over, will it work? This is awkward sitting.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty. I have a dream that one day this nation will live out the true meaning of its creed.
If I could see that looking at
we
it.
hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day sons of former slaves will they be able to see people of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, be transformed into oases of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious races, with its governor having his lips dripping with Dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill shall be made full, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And see it together. This is our with this faith, we will be able to with this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discourse into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to pray together, to struggle together, to change together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing be able to sing with new meaning. My country tears of thee. We let the liberty of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrims pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the hiking Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia, of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill. Every city and every hamlet, from every state and every city. We will be able to speed up that day with all of the children to will be able to spiritual free atmosphere.
Okay, so that I think is very important on a King Day, that we actually hear the speech of Dr. King. It's very, very critical, and it's something that we need to do and we need to hear. So I'm very, very grateful that I was able to play that, because I want to always assume that everybody doesn't know everything. I'm still learning, and I'm a senior at this point. I consider myself an elder, and I'm still learning. And I know that there are young people that were born after the time of Dr. King, so they didn't have the personal experience, of actually what happened, what occurred. The segregation that is happening now is not necessarily so overt, like you can't, go in the store or you can't sit down, but the segregation still exists, okay? And it's a more subtle circumstance. But it's important that even visually people can see Dr. King, hear Dr. King, and then maybe do some deeper dives into what that's about. And I literally just looking at that speech at the Lincoln Monument, because I had the honor of being there when Reverend Sharpton had the March on Washington. It's something that just gives you chills to be there in the crowd. And Dr. Martin Luther King's the third was there and spoke. All of the families of those that had lost life that year, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor, they were all there. And it was such a hot summer day, yes, that literally in that pond or lake or whatever it is, people were literally in the water. And it just brought to mind, I was like, wade in the water. I mean, it was just a literal experience. And then we walked from the Lincoln Monument to the monument for Dr. King, which is my background today.
Yes.
And that was a very empowering experience. You know, if you go to Washington, you got to go there, because when you come into the passageways, it's almost, and I haven't been to Egypt yet, or Kemet, but it's almost like you feel like you are walking into the tomb. And then you go around and there is this massive, you know, bust and statue of Dr. King that's looking out over the water. So it's a very connective experience. So we're gonna wind ourselves down, Dawn, but if you would speak a little bit about voting in New York City. We know we've had voter suppression happening actively in some of the states, but here in New York City, the voter suppression is subtle.
Yes.
And it's in the sense that people are just not voting. Why are they not voting? Because they feel their vote doesn't matter, or also because they are not informed. And that's why Harlem Network News is so important. And we really need you to reach out to Harlem Network News. We need you to make contributions. We need you to call us, like if you have information, because it's difficult. A lot of times, everybody doesn't know what's going on. Okay, so that's a part of the problem. And I call it media suppression, you know, because Harlem Network News doesn't have the same money to get out there and do what New York One can do. You know what I'm saying? So we're reaching the bandwidth that we can, but in the spirit of Marcus Messiah Garvey, we've got to support our own. So go to harlemnetworknews.com, go to our Zelle, which is harlemnetworknews@gmail.com, go to our Cash App, $ Harlem Network News, or call us at 646-261-5397. We matter, you matter. So talk a little bit about what the voting experience has been. Tell us a little bit, Dawn, about the Democratic clubs and about some of the elections that are coming up and how you think we need to tool ourselves to really be successful. And
yes, and remember that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he was the driving force behind the watershed events such as the Montgomery bus boycott and the 1963 March on Washington. As you stated, I've probably gone to all of Reverend Sharpton's, as well as when I was in, I'm trying to remember, was elementary school. When, as I stated, Theodore Lacey, who lived on my block, organized the rally. Wow. I still have my t-shirts. I try to make sure I do like a collection here of t-shirts.
Okay, I love it.
For all the March on Washingtons that I've attended. And it helped to bring such landmark legislation as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 and was remembered each year on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which is the federal holiday, is on Monday. So basically, living in Building 10, when I moved to Building 10, I was renting in a private house in Queens and moved to Building 10. The first thing my girlfriend who lives here in Esplanade said, "You were in the political building." Okay. I didn't know that I was in Percy Sutton's building. Then I had a cousin who recently transitioned who lived in the building. And I basically got recruited into politics just by walking down 135th Street.
I love it.
It's totally different living here because a lot of the folks here are mad at the politicians because of our capital improvement situation. Mm-hmm. But I was invited to the Democratic Club. I was working in the 70s on the polls, and they asked me would I like to work closer to home, which when you have to be to work at 4 or 5 in the morning, it is better to be close to home.
I hear you.
You have a 9-to-5 job, it's not a big problem hopping on the train to go to work. Mm-hmm. But as far as working at that time of morning, you do like to be close to home. So being a part of the Democratic Club, I've worked on the polls for, I would say, approximately 32 years. And like you stated, the subtle voter-
Clap it up.
Yes, the subtle voter suppression here in New York City is when they sometimes change our polling sites. maybe people might have missed the notice in the mail, but it's not really relayed to the person. And then when they get to the table, either their polling site is changed or their name isn't there. Also, when we try to do voter registration efforts, I've seen you between your restaurant at Harlem Week.
Yes,
And I think it's very important to have visuals. And that is what's very difficult to get from the Board of Elections. We basically have to make our own signs. We may have to just get like, plastic skirts, tablecloths. I do have a Board of Elections sign, and I actually lent one to our new Senator Cordell Clear. But just getting a basic sign from the Board of Elections is very hard. When I did get one, I got it laminated, but we don't have enough visual when we're out doing voter registration. And I feel that basically the only thing that the Board of Elections provides us with is voter registration forms, which also you can do that online now. But I feel that we need to have more visual when we're out there. And those are the two things that I see as voter suppression here in the city, is where it's just making people awkward and discouraged when it comes time on the day to vote. Okay, if their name isn't there, they don't even want to go to look for the next polling place. They just want to go back home. So those are things that can discourage voters. But basically, it's not as blatant as it is in the South as far as voter suppression is concerned. But as a chair of National Action Network Political Action Committee, that is something that my members always like me to address. And I also like to, with our Second Chance Committee, chaired by Victor Pate, to get out the word that you can vote with a criminal record here in New York State. So those are the things that whether we try to do forums for themes of the month, but we like to make sure that is gotten out at each forum. If we can't do it each Saturday at the rallies, but at least get it out at our forums so that people are not held back from the voting process.
Okay, well, thank you for all the great work that you're doing. And I think the other thing that concerns me, even though we're hitting people over the head, is to really get more people out to vote. I think in a city like New York, our voting percentages are so low. And that really impacts like who gets elected, because there are only a certain amount of people that are voting. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of people aren't voting because, once again, this is systemic racism. I'm Terri, and those of you who are just joining Harlem Network News, and we are celebrating the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in celebrating his birth, we're just talking about the many issues that he stood for. And a lot of those issues are still on the table today, if not in a worsened state, because you don't have the same engagement that you have with people. But I think that a lot of people are just overwhelmed with the struggle of living. And then I also think that I would say that everything is not as in order in some ways as it was, in terms of the family structure. Segregation in some ways actually made people be more active out of the conditions. You know, if they were going to all Black schools, the teachers were always trying to make sure that they were taught and that they were 3 times as good. You know, so you have a lot of that. And then the moral fabric of the society has really broken down a lot. So I think that all of those factors really factor into why people are overwhelmed. Obviously, when we look at our housing and we say, okay, the mean income in, or the mean apartment or something in New York City is $5,000, who can afford that? And then you look at the disparity, because we're not looking at things holistically. Well, why is there mental illness? People are stressed out and, are on the verge of getting kicked out of their home. They have food insecurity. All of these things factor into why it doesn't seem like voting's important, but obviously who you have in office matters. And then making that public official accountable. And that takes a lot of work, and time is money. So, I mean, we've got to look at it, but people have got to understand, we've got to walk the streets to know that we've really got to make some extreme efforts for change. And if only 3% of the people vote, then those 3% are determining what's going to happen to you. So just briefly, Dawn, because we're going to close out, can you really share about the Democratic clubs that exist, the role that the Democratic clubs have? And then I know that we have a city council position that is coming up for re-election. And there are several people who are going to run for that office. And I want to say that because I want people to begin to get tooled, to get informed. As a journalist, we're not telling people who to vote for, but we want people to know so that they can do their homework and make decisions for the best candidates. And we also want people to practice activism. You know, though we have a Black mayor, though we have a Black, head of city council and a state senator, you still have to reach out to those people and have your voice heard. You know, it's so, so critical. I experienced that. I was on the committee for the Gate of the Exonerated for 2 years, and that was a win. We actually saw that happen. You know, we all didn't get along. We all didn't have the same views, but at the end of the day, we were able to name a gate for the exonerated farm in honor of the exonerated. This is a powerful thing. They've never named a gate in 160 years in Central Park. And the week before, we actually had to go before the design commission for New York City because somebody challenged it. But we went, we stood the course, and we won. The design commission voted unanimously. You know, so it doesn't stop with the naming of the gate. Now we have to continue. We got to go to the website, you know, the Gate of the Exonerated. You know, it's got to go into the curriculum, which I know that was happening as well. You know, but it shows that you can make a difference, but it takes a lot, you know, to steer the course. So Dawn Jones, could you just share a little bit about the Democratic Club process and some of the elections that are coming up, and when cutoffs, if you know, are for people to register way ahead so that they can vote in these primaries? Very important. More voter education necessary on this historic birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you.
And when you mentioned Democratic Club, I'm an executive member of the Frederick E. Samuel Democratic Club, where I do chair the Political Action Committee. But since COVID, we've been inactive where we're doing our meetings online. We are one of the only Democratic clubs that meet weekly, and we still have a building. Gail Brewer recognized in the whole entire Manhattan, we're the only Democratic club that still has a storefront. We have the Michelle Obama Democratic Club that's headed by Senator Cordell Clear, but they don't have an actual meeting space. They meet in different locations. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then you have the Martin Luther King Democratic Club. They once did have a storefront. Okay, that's led by former Congressman Charles B. Rangel and Assemblywoman Inez Dickens. Yes. And then you come over on this side, there's the Tioga Democratic Club led by Assemblyman Al Taylor and Ernestine Bell Temple. And with me working over on this side now, when I was working at the polls at Savoy Park, but I'm closer now to Esplanade Gardens, which is the 71st Assembly District and the 70th. So we have actual polling sites in both because the late Denny Farrell fought to keep it there. Now, Sharon Salam happens to be a member of the Frederick E. Samuel Democratic Club. Yes. So I partly
was the mother of Dr.
Yusef Salam, who is running for New York City Council. And I was a part of that Central Park 5 case because they used to meet. My uncle's church is Mount Morris Presbyterian Ascension. He's the late Russell Williams. And my cousin, Reverend Juan Guthrie, they were both pastors of that great institution. Wow. And the Central Park 5 met at that church when no one else would open the doors to their church. Now, the late Clarence P. Grant also at Convent Avenue Baptist Church also let the Central Park Five hold meetings in the church. But how I got involved in the church is because they were meeting at Mount Morris Presbyterian Ascension, and I would actually leave.
Where is that located?
That's located at 122nd and 5th Avenue, right here in the historic Mount Morris section, properly named Marcus Garvey Park. Okay. And they met there. And so I would go out during my lunch hour and march in front of the district attorney's office. So at that gate, when they did the naming, there were people like Attorney Roger Wareham, D12, National Action Network, that were actually there from the very beginning of the process of, you know, seeing that those young people would be freed, but it was definitely not an easy process. I actually didn't think they would ever be freed. I just ran down there to go march in a circle because that's what I did.
You know, God put a strong hand in.
Exactly. Just like I ran over to Inglewood for this Bernard Placid case. So that's just what I do. And so the thing in Harlem that I wish that we have our county leader keep LT right, but that we all can come together and get behind one candidate. Okay. I mean, you know, I've been in races where I've won, I've been in races where I lost, but when I'm trying to do something, you just named the accomplishment of the exonerated 5 gate.
Yes.
My name is on the statue of the Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Memorial Committee. I feel that's an accomplishment. I was on the 75th birthday of Malcolm X. And now with the centennial for the New Amsterdam Musical Association, when I go to approach my elected official and they don't respond, I just have an issue with that, or with our current councilwoman. I like what she's doing regarding housing, and that we're not gonna have a monstrosity to block our views here in Esplanade Gardens. But when I come to you for something that has to do with an institution that has been in the Harlem community for 100 years, and I don't get a response, but I have the councilwoman who's not even in the district to award from the mayor all the way to the city council, and the current councilwoman does not respond, I am very disappointed. And I'm not going to say specifically, because when you're in a Democratic club, you do have to have loyalty, but it's going to be a very awkward position this time, because you have 3 people that are known in the community that have done good work and that are running. And my concern is that they are going to split the vote. And this current councilwoman is going to get back in that is not really meeting with anyone. The unions are not happy with her. And like I stated, I'm just not happy when I was trying to get something for an institution that has been in the Harlem community for over 100 years. They celebrated their centennial, and that a lot of businesses are closing and they've remained. So that's the disappointment that I have with the current councilwoman. And I'm just concerned of the way the Harlem politics are going. I look at the Bronx. I'm sure that they have Democratic clubs there. Okay. Yes. And I worked there for a number of years before I was been working in downtown Brooklyn for about 10 years now. But what I see with the Bronx, they have what's called the Bronx Democrats. Okay, maybe they had other holiday parties. I don't know about them, but from what I know, they have their one party at Maestro's or one of those catering halls, whereas we have holiday parties every block, you know, every 10 blocks. And I just don't feel that we're united or together. And that's just the way that I look at it when I look at the
it's very concerning, because Harlem is under siege. And we know that we have a lot of forces that are coming at us. And, you know, one of the things that was beautiful about the pandemic is it took the scab off the wound. The things that we already knew came front and center with the pandemic. Okay. And it is still the same. What's going on with economics? What is going on with education? What is going on with health? What is going on with homeless? All of these things are magnified in our community. So it's extremely important that we be strategic in terms of our vote. And then we also hold our public officials accountable. You know, so I think it's very important that we all know what's going on and we all come together. We know that right now with the position of city council, we have our state senator, not our state senator, I'm sorry, our state assembly person, Al Taylor, Reverend Al Taylor, who has announced that he is going to run for city council officially. We also have our assembly member, Inez Dickens, who has also given her official announcement this week that she is going to run for city council. I trust that our city council incumbent, Christian Richardson Jordan, is going to run again for city council. And we also have Dr. Yusef Salam, who I don't believe has made his official announcement, but is planning to run for city council as well. So the prayer is that the community is very informed and can make educated choices as to who would be best to represent us, but also that we pull it together strategically, in terms of who, because since we have, as the young people say, voter suppression on the low, we need to make sure that more people vote. We need to make sure that more people can vote and vote in an informed way. But we also need to make sure that the Democratic clubs and the machines, behind, and I say Democratic because for the most part, the people are Democrats here in New York City,
Right.
So we need these clubs to come together to be strategic so that we come out winning for Harlem and for the community. And as James Baldwin said, and we're going to end with that, so goes Harlem, so goes the world. And happy birthday, Dr. King, in Stevie Wonder fashion. Happy birthday to you. So we thank you, Dawn, for joining us. Have a blessed day. I know there's a lot going on at the churches here in Harlem. I will be going to Abyssinian Baptist Church, and we do have a keynote speaker there. And obviously, just in all the prayers that go up, all the losses, our pastor, the Reverend Dr. Calvin O'Butts transition this past 2022 in November time. So we have a lot going on here, but we are having as a keynote speaker for our Dr. King program, and the mantra is legacy, empower, and witness. And we have the educator and author, Dr. Jelani Cobb, who has been appointed as the Dean of the School of Journalism, who will be speaking, our keynote speaker for Dr. King Day. So that's at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, right there on 138th and Odell Park Place. But I know so many of the other churches are having events, and we do ask you, and you probably hear about it after, but we're doing it on social media. Go down to the New York Historical Society and check out the exhibit, Black is Beautiful, a good thing to do on Dr. King Day. It's right at 80th Street and Central Park West. I think, I'm not sure what the fee is, but they have some good specials for the fee. And you can also pull up on your app on your phone, on the Bloomberg app, and go to the New York Historical Society. And, it can be curated for you personally. So that's what I have to say. And Harlem Network News, we're standing strong in this 2023. And we appreciate you, and we're grateful, and we need you to support us. And thank you, Dawn, for all the great work that you do. You are very consistent, and that is what is needed. Get involved, everybody. And as James Brown said, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. So thank you very much. Blessings to you. Take care, and thank you, Dawn.
Peace and blessings.
Reverend Sharpton for kicking it off today. So take care. Thank you.